The transport hummed at a frequency that made Velthran's secondary nerve cluster ache. She had filed the complaint 4 times. The quorum had acknowledged it twice, resolved it 0 times, and she had stopped filing. This was, she supposed, one of the first things the humans would have recognized about her. She adapted. She stopped fighting the small battles so she could conserve something for the large ones. She did not know, sitting in the catalog bay of the Velshorn Transport 9, waiting for the manifest to load, that within the next 14 hours she would understand humans in a way no cataloger in the history of the quorum had ever documented, and that the understanding would leave her changed in ways she was still, even now, struggling to articulate. Let me begin with the dare. It was Assessor Prendow who said it. Prendow, who had never once left the observation deck during a field survey, who catalogued atmospheric readings and called it fieldwork, who ate his protein ration with the precise, joyless efficiency of a machine performing maintenance on itself. Prendow, sitting across from her in the prep bay, as the human cargo manifest populated on her screen, watching her scan the names with what he imagined was a casual expression, and what was actually barely concealed contempt. "You could sit beside one," he said. She had looked up. The rest of the cataloging team, 7 of them, all senior-ranked, all attached to this survey rotation by some combination of academic ambition and political necessity, had gone very still in the way that prey animals go still when a predator makes an unexpected sound. The humans, Prendow clarified as if she might have thought he meant something else. On the transport, there are 4 of them traveling under diplomatic clearance. You could sit beside one for the whole crossing. She had looked back at her screen. I am a cataloger. I observe from a neutral distance. That is the methodology. That is the methodology for flora, said Prendow, and microbial life, and geological formations. The humans have been in contact with the quorum for 2 years. We have 900 field reports, and not one of them answers the fundamental question. She knew the question. Everyone in the bay knew the question. It sat at the center of every briefing, every report submission, every anxious quorum session that ran past the 3rd bell. The fundamental question was not what humans were made of. The biology reports were thorough. It was not what humans wanted. The diplomatic corps handled that badly, but they handled it. The fundamental question, the one that made senior assessors lose sleep, and caused 3 separate field agents to request reassignment to the outer cataloging posts where nothing dangerous lived, was this. Why did every single engagement team that approached humans with aggression fail? Not fail as in suffer tactical setbacks. Fail as in cease to function as engagement teams. Some came back silent, some came back changed, some did not come back. What made them dangerous? I'll do it, she said. The bay went still again. She had not planned to say it. The words had arrived before the decision, which was itself a very human thing to do, though she would not learn that until later. Prendow blinked his secondary lids. I was speaking rhetorically. I know, I'm answering practically. She saved her manifest and stood. I'll sit beside one for the full crossing. I'll document everything. You can have the first look at the raw notes before I format them for submission. She looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for assessors who confused their rank with their intelligence. Unless you'd like to do it yourself. He would not. She had known he would not. She had known it before she spoke, which was why she spoke. This was adaptation, turning the pressure of a dare into the momentum of a choice. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bunk in the narrow assessor cabin and reviewed everything the quorum had on humans, which was a great deal of data arranged in a way that explained almost nothing. Humans were bilaterally symmetrical, bipedal, warm-blooded, social. They communicated primarily through a spoken language system of remarkable complexity and a secondary, largely involuntary system of facial and postural signals that their own species frequently misread. They were by any biological measure fragile. Their bones broke, their skin tore. They required precise atmospheric conditions, narrow temperature bands, regular liquid and caloric intake. They slept for a third of their available time and were cognitively impaired without it. They aged. They died of causes that the Quorum's basic medical technology had rendered irrelevant centuries ago. None of this explained the engagement failures. She read the redacted field reports until the lights in the corridor dimmed to night cycle. Then she closed her screen and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Prendau had said. You could sit beside one. As if proximity itself was the experiment. As if there was something that the instruments couldn't measure that a body next to a body might feel. She thought he was probably right, and she thought she was probably not going to like what she learned. The human was sitting in seat 47 when she entered the transit bay at the first bell of morning cycle. She had reviewed the diplomatic manifest. His name was rendered in the Quorum's transliteration as Merc Solis, and he was listed as a technical liaison, Category 3, which meant the Quorum's diplomatic corps considered him non-threatening, specialized, and probably bored. He was traveling to the secondary relay station at Vethanu to consult on a communications array that 3 Quorum engineers had been unable to repair for 11 months. He was 29 years old in human years. He had the look of someone who had spent a great deal of time in small rooms thinking about problems. She sat beside him. He looked up from the device in his hands, small, flat, covered in small text and diagrams she couldn't quite read, and said something in his language, then paused, and said it again in the Quorum's trade tongue. Morning. Good morning, she said, which was the correct formal response according to the diplomatic briefing documents. He went back to his device. She waited. She had been told in the briefing documents that humans valued what they called small talk, low-stakes social exchange that established rapport and signaled non-aggression. She had prepared 3 topics. The first was the weather on the transit route, which was irrelevant since they were in space. The second was an observation about the transport's infrastructure, which felt too technical. The third was a question about his work, which the briefing document said was often a good opener. I understand you're repairing a communications array, she said. He looked up again. His eyes were a gray-brown color that the Quorum's records called hazel. They were, she noticed, very direct. Humans looked at things with a frankness that she found either admirably honest or faintly aggressive, and she was never sure which. Trying to, he said. Whether I actually repair it is a different question. You are not confident. I'm confident about the problem. I'm less confident about the politics. He shifted in his seat, angling slightly toward her in a way the body language briefing told her indicated engagement. Have you worked with the team at Vethanu? I have filed 12 reports derived from their atmospheric readings. He made a small sound that was, she would learn, a laugh, but a quiet, compressed kind, the kind that acknowledged something without committing to finding it funny. The atmospheric readings are great. It's everything else that's the problem. The communications array. The team, he said. 3 senior engineers who all have different theories and none of them wrong, which is actually harder to navigate than one of them being wrong. If somebody's wrong, you can show them the data. When everybody's partially right, you just get stalemate. He looked back at his device, then set it down on his knee, and she understood that he had made a decision to continue talking, a choice that people make rarely and usually mean. Do you run into that? In cataloging? She considered the question. It was, she realized, a real question. Not diplomatic smoothing, not the kind of polite inquiry that wanted a polite answer. He was actually asking. Yes, she said. The problem with cataloging is that accurate data about a thing does not necessarily produce understanding of a thing. I can have 900 reports about a phenomenon and still not know what the phenomenon is. He was looking at her now with that direct hazel gaze. What phenomenon? She had not planned to say it, but she had already decided, somewhere between her bunk and this seat, that she was not going to do this the way the briefing documents described. She was going to be a cataloger. She was going to observe and report honestly, including to herself. She said, humans, we have extensive data. We do not have understanding. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the deep between stars did what it always did. It waited. What don't you understand? He asked. Why you're dangerous. He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something she did not expect. He smiled. Not the diplomatic smile, the wide performed one in the briefing documents. This was smaller. It reached his eyes. It had something in it she did not have a word for in the trade tongue. A kind of rueful acknowledgement, as if she'd said something he'd been waiting a long time for someone to say out loud. That, he said, is a really good question. They talked for 3 hours before he slept. She had expected the conversation to be difficult, laborious, technical, full of the kind of mutual misunderstanding that the diplomatic corps had documented extensively. Instead, it was the opposite of difficult. He spoke the trade tongue with an accent she found genuinely pleasant, and he listened in a way she wasn't used to, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually following the line of her thinking, asking questions that proved he'd understood the last answer before asking the next one. She had been trained in 16 cataloging languages and conducted over 400 field interviews, and she had never, in any of them, had the feeling that she was being genuinely heard. She cataloged this carefully. It was, she noted, already affecting her. This was data. When he slept, humans could sleep in any position, in almost any circumstance, with a speed and total commitment that she found both enviable and alarming. She sat beside him and read the field reports again. She read them differently now. She had a reference point she hadn't had before. She read the description of Field Team 7's first contact with a human settlement, in which 3 heavily armed Quorum scouts had approached a human female who was alone, apparently unarmed, apparently performing maintenance on an agricultural machine, and had opened negotiation by displaying their weapons in the standard dominance signal. The woman had looked at the weapons for a moment. Then she had returned to her maintenance. One of the scouts had moved to physically reposition her, to force acknowledgement of the dominance display. The woman had picked up a tool from her kit and hit the scout with it so hard that his exoskeletal plate had cracked. This was documented as an unprovoked escalation, and that characterization had always confused Velthran because the escalation was clearly provoked. But now, sitting beside the sleeping human, she understood what the report writer had actually meant, which was something different. The escalation was disproportionate. The scout had expected fear or compliance. He had not expected a woman performing maintenance to have made, in approximately half a second, a complete threat assessment that concluded the most efficient response was immediate counterviolence. He had not expected her to be so fast. He had not expected her to already have a tool in her hand. She had not escalated, she had responded. The difference was enormous, and the Quorum's cataloging language didn't have a clean way to express it. She sat with this for a while, listening to Merc Solis breathe beside her, slow and regular, with occasional small sounds she couldn't classify, and she began to understand something that the 900 reports had buried in data without ever naming. The human wasn't the most dangerous thing in any given situation. The human was the variable that changed what the most dangerous thing in the situation was. She wrote this in her notes and then crossed it out and wrote it again, because she wanted to make sure she had it right. He woke 3 hours later with the same speed with which he'd fallen asleep. Suddenly, completely, eyes open, orientated. He glanced at her and said, "You didn't sleep. I don't require as much as you do. Do you need more, less?" The question surprised her. He was asking about her biology the way he might ask about a preference, not clinical, curious. "Less," she said. I require 4 standard hours in a 32-hour cycle. That sounds amazing, he said, with what she was beginning to recognize as his standard mode of honest expression. A sentence that meant exactly what it said and nothing else. Then, did you eat? I don't require. That's not what I asked. He was already reaching into the bag beneath his seat, not looking at her, the movement as casual as breathing. He produced 2 packages, one of his own provisions, one of the Quorum Standard protein supplements that the transport provided for non-human passengers. He checked the labeling on the second with his device, cross-referencing something quickly. These are yours, I think, unless you're a Vel-class species, in which case the mineral ratios are wrong and you'd want to flag it to the transport crew. She took the package from him. She was, in fact, Vel-class, and the mineral ratios were, in fact, sometimes wrong, and she had already resolved to eat sparingly rather than raise a complaint she didn't believe would be resolved. He had assessed this from her identification marker on the manifest, which was publicly visible, and a mineral ratio table he apparently kept on his personal device, and he had done it while half asleep and before his own first meal, not because he had been instructed to, but because it occurred to him to do it. She flagged the provisions to the transport crew. The ratios were corrected within 40 minutes. This, too, she wrote in her notes. The second day of the crossing was when she began to understand the danger in its structural form. She had been watching him work. This was, technically, within her mandate as a cataloger. Observing non-combat human activity was listed as Category B documentation, low priority, mostly useful for baseline behavioral studies. She was supposed to be working on her atmospheric variance reports. She was not. She was watching Merc Solis sit cross-legged on his seat with his device in his lap and 3 physical notebooks open at different pages around him, and she was trying to understand his process. He was not reading linearly. He would spend several minutes in one notebook, then switch to his device, then spend a few minutes writing in a second notebook, then return to the device, and occasionally make small notations in the third notebook that seemed to have no relation to anything else she could observe. He appeared, to the casual observer, disorganized. She knew enough about cataloging methodology to recognize that he wasn't disorganized. He was running parallel processes. The 3 notebooks were different tracks. He was maintaining all of them simultaneously while feeding information between them in a pattern she couldn't quite map from the outside. She asked him about it eventually. He explained that the first notebook was systems architecture, what the array was supposed to do. The second was failure analysis, what it was currently doing wrong. The third was what he called the uncomfortable questions, which he defined as questions he didn't want to ask because the answers would complicate everything, but which needed to be asked so he'd stopped writing them on his device where they'd distract him from the main thread. "What's in the third notebook now?" she asked. He showed her. She read the current entry. What if the 3 engineers are wrong in ways they agree with each other about? Consensus error. What does that look like from outside the consensus? She stared at this for a moment. "You wrote that before you arrived, before you'd spoken to them." "I wrote it because I know I'm going to want to assume they're smart and experienced and have probably already thought of everything I'd think of," he said. "Which they have. They've documented it all. The question is whether they've all been thinking from the same starting assumption for so long that they've stopped being able to see it. That's not a stupidity problem. That's a proximity problem." He took the notebook back. "I don't want to be rude about their work. But I also don't want to not fix the array because I was polite." She thought about the 900 reports again. She thought about the quorum assessors who had been cataloging humans for 2 years and had produced 900 reports that agreed with each other about what was in the data and had failed to agree on what the data meant. She thought about Prendau, who had never left the observation deck, who had called her data excellent and whose recommendations had not once resulted in a change of approach. "Proximity problem," she said quietly. "Yeah," he was writing again, fast, the pen moving in short, decisive strokes. You want to stay close enough to understand the thing and far enough to see it whole. It's the hardest part of any diagnostic. He paused, looked up. Is that what you're doing, on this crossing, trying to see it whole? She took a breath. Yes, she said, though I suspect I've already made the proximity error. He looked at her for a moment with the hazel eyes. Too close or too far? I don't know yet. He nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer to a perfectly reasonable question. He went back to his notebooks. She went back to watching him, and she noted. He had not asked her what she was trying to understand. He had not needed to. He already knew because she had told him the first morning. He remembered everything she said. He just didn't make a production of it. On the third morning, one of the other 3 humans on the transport found her in the common area. This one's name, according to the manifest, was Dr. HFY, and she was traveling under a different diplomatic classification, cultural liaison, which meant the quorum expected her to do something nebulous and interpersonal and probably not quantifiable. She was small, which by human standards meant she was smaller than average, not small in any absolute sense. Velthran was larger than her by nearly a full body length. She wore her dark hair coiled at the back of her head with apparent efficiency, and she moved through the transport with the kind of ease that came from being comfortable in unfamiliar spaces, which was itself a form of intelligence that the quorum's briefing documents categorized under social adaptability, without quite understanding what it meant. She sat across from Velthran without asking, which in quorum custom would have been a mild social transgression. She set down her coffee. Humans carried their hot liquid stimulant everywhere, with a religiosity that the food consumption reports had documented and never quite explained, and looked at Velthran with straightforward curiosity. You're the one sitting with Merc, she said. I'm documenting him, Velthran said. It is a cataloging exercise. With the small sound again, the noncommittal acknowledgement. How's that going? I am finding it more complicated than anticipated. HFY looked at her the way people look when they already know the answer, and are waiting to see if you'll figure it out yourself. It was, Velthran noted, a very similar expression to the one Merc had used the first morning, when she'd said she didn't understand why humans were dangerous, and he'd said that's a really good question. Both of them looked at difficulty the same way, not with discomfort, but with something that functioned like appetite. What's complicated? HFY asked. Velthran considered whether to answer honestly. She decided she would. She had already committed with the dare to an honest experiment. I came on this crossing with a specific framework, she said. I was trying to understand what makes your species dangerous. From an operational standpoint, the quorum has lost several engagement teams and has not satisfactorily explained why. And I cannot find the danger. I have been with Merc Solis for 40 hours. He is not violent. He is not threatening. He is fixing notebooks and carrying his meals around and asking me whether I've eaten. I cannot locate in him the thing the quorum's engagement reports describe. HFY drank her coffee. Outside the viewport, a binary star system, they were passing through printed light across the observation panel in 2 overlapping circles of gold. I think, she said carefully, that you're looking for the wrong thing. Then what is the right thing? She set her cup down. When you say dangerous, you mean effective, right? Not malicious. You mean the quality that makes us hard to stop. Velthran acknowledged this was a more precise formulation of what she meant. It's not a thing we have, HFY said. It's a thing we do. It's the way she paused, seeming to search for the right structure in the trade tongue, the way we recategorize situations, under pressure. We don't have a threat response that locks us into a single behavior. We have a threat response that interrupts our current behavior and asks, what do I know, what do I have, what do I need? And then we use the answer. She touched the side of her coffee cup with one finger absently. The quorum's engagement teams failed because they approached us with a fixed protocol. The protocol had a specific expected response built into it. When we didn't produce that response, the protocol had no next step. Velthran stared at her. "The woman with the tool," she said. Asha raised an eyebrow. "Field Team 7. A human female performing agricultural maintenance. Your scouts approached with a dominance display. She struck the lead scout with a maintenance tool." "That sounds right." The report classified it as an unprovoked escalation. I understood that was wrong, she was responding to a provocation. But what you're describing is, she didn't escalate. She recategorized. The scouts were holding weapons and she was holding a tool, and she assessed in a fraction of a second that her tool in her hands in that moment was the more effective response. "Probably," Asha said. "She also probably scared herself. We usually do after a pause. But the fear comes after, not before." Velthran sat very still. "The fear comes after," she repeated slowly, like something that wanted to be written down before it could escape. "Yes," Asha picked up her coffee again. "We're not brave. We're just the fear doesn't always arrive in time to stop us. And by the time it gets there, we've usually already done the thing." The third notebook, Velthran thought, the uncomfortable questions. They talked for 2 more hours. By the end of it, Velthran had more material than she had collected in 40 previous field surveys, and she had the uneasy feeling that she had been, in some way she couldn't exactly specify, researched in return. That evening she went back to Merk and told him what she and Asha had discussed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Did she tell you the second part?" "What second part?" "The part about the sweetness." He said it in his own language first, and then in the trade tongue, and the word had the same quality in both, not metaphor but almost. It's what makes it hard for outsiders to understand. The thing that makes us hard to stop isn't the violence when there is violence. The violence is just a symptom. The thing that makes us hard to stop is, he paused, clicked his pen a few times, we like things. We like people. We form attachments very easily, and we treat those attachments as worth protecting without calculating whether the calculation makes rational sense. He clicked the pen again. A human will do something tactically irrational to protect someone they love or something they care about. Every time. Not because they've decided it's the right move. Because the attachment is already made, and the threat to it is already activating the response before the rational mind has a chance to object. She looked at him. "That sounds like a weakness." "It is," he said. "It's absolutely a weakness. From a pure efficiency standpoint, it's disastrous. Ask any quorum engagement team that came at a human settlement." He smiled, and this time the smile had something in it she'd been trying to name since the first morning. She finally had a word for it. Fond asterisk. He was fond of this. He was fond of the absurdity of it. We will throw ourselves into situations that make no rational sense whatsoever because someone we care about is in danger. And then we will perform at the absolute outer edge of our capability in that situation. And then afterward we'll shake for an hour because the fear finally arrived. Velthran thought about this for a very long time. "The engagement teams," she said finally, "they targeted the settlements." "Yes." "They didn't understand that a settlement is a collection of attachments." He looked at her with the direct hazel gaze, and she saw that she had said something that mattered. "No," he said. "They didn't. If you threaten the settlement, you activate the attachment response in every individual simultaneously." "Yes." "And the attachment response removes the rational objection to risk." "Yes." So what should have been a deterrent, the weapons, the force display, the numerical advantage, became a provocation that removed the primary tactical obstacle. "Which is," he said softly, "us deciding it's not worth it." She wrote very quickly for several minutes. He watched her write without asking to see it, which she appreciated. When she stopped, she looked at him, and she understood that she had, somewhere in the last 3 days, made an attachment that her rational mind had not approved. She understood this because when she thought about the crossing ending in 11 hours, when the transport reached Vethanu and they went their separate ways, she felt, clearly and precisely, that this would be a loss. The fear arrived before the thing happened for her. That was the Vel-class difference, she supposed. They felt the future before it arrived. She told him this because she had decided on the dare to be honest. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the stars moved with the patient indifference of things that had been there before anything lived, and would be there after everything died. "That's lonely," he said. "It is common for my species. Doesn't make it less lonely." She didn't know how to respond to this, so she said nothing. He seemed to understand that she didn't know how to respond, because he didn't push, just went back to his notebook, and she sat beside him in the humming transit bay and felt, with his warmth at the edge of her awareness and the stars sliding past, something that she would later describe to the quorum as an emotional interference pattern she was unable to fully characterize. She suspected the quorum would accept this phrasing without understanding what it meant. She understood what it meant. She sat with him through the night cycle. At some point she stopped taking notes and simply sat. At some point after that she thought, this is what the engagement teams couldn't survive, not the violence. This, a creature that could, in 3 days, across every cultural and biological barrier she carried, make her feel that his presence in the universe was something she had a stake in. A creature that recategorized her from cataloger to colleague to something she didn't have a word for in the trade tongue, something that sat somewhere between witness and companion and person. Who knows, you. A creature that had fixed her mineral rations because it occurred to him to check, and who had asked her to look at his uncomfortable questions notebook, and who had, when she told him that she feared things before they happened, said that's lonely. Not how interesting or please elaborate for the record. Just that's lonely, with the weight of someone who had, at some point, learned what lonely meant. She understood, finally, what the 900 reports had failed to produce. Understanding was the danger. The quorum's engagement teams hadn't been defeated by violence, though there had been violence. They'd been defeated because they got close enough, long enough, to understand that what they were looking at wasn't an obstacle. It was people. And once you understood that, the thing inside you that was capable of treating people as obstacles became much harder to access. Not impossible, but harder. Measurably, materially, operationally harder. You had to work against something in yourself that hadn't been there before the understanding arrived. And humans generated that understanding very quickly. They were made for it, honed for it by whatever evolutionary pressure had shaped them on their wet, warm, medium-sized world. They were engines of connection. They looked at strangers and found the things they recognized. They asked questions and actually listened to the answers. They checked mineral ratios. They said that's lonely. They made you feel, without your consent and without even trying, that you mattered. This was the weapon. This was the thing no battle analysis had named, because no battle analyst had been willing to sit beside one for the whole crossing and find out. She told Merck this. At the last bell before the transit bay lights shifted to pre-arrival amber. He listened. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute, which was a long time for him. She watched him process it, the way she had watched him process the notebook pages, following the thread, checking it, following it again. "That's a very generous theory," he said at last. "I am a cataloger. I do not generate theories as a kindness. I generate them as accurately as I can." "I know," another pause. "I just don't know if it's entirely true. We do the connection thing. But we also," he shook his head, "we also do the opposite of connection when we're frightened, or when we're stupid, or when someone with authority tells us to. We can be talked out of seeing people as people very efficiently under the right conditions." He looked at his hands. "That's worth cataloging too." "I will," she said. "It is part of the same system." He nodded. She could see, from the shift in his posture and the quality of his stillness, that they were close to the end of something, and that he felt it too. This was the attachment response working in real time. She was watching his body process an anticipated loss. "What will you put in the report?" he asked. She thought about it. She thought about Prendau and the observation deck and the comfortable distance from which he would read her findings and acknowledge them in his precise, joyless way. She thought about the quorum sessions that would receive her data. She thought about what it would mean to hand the quorum a clear answer to the fundamental question. "I will tell them the truth," she said. "That what makes you dangerous is what makes you survivable, which is that you refuse to stop caring about things long enough to treat them as expendable. And that this refusal is not a sentimental anomaly, it is a structural feature of your cognition. You are built around attachment the way we are built around categorization. You cannot operate without it any more than I can operate without data." She paused. "And I will tell them that any strategy premised on isolating humans from the things they care about, the settlements, each other, will fail, because isolation does not neutralize the attachment response. It intensifies it. You do not become less dangerous when you lose things. You become more dangerous because there is no longer any calculation to interrupt." Merck solely sat with this. He turned his pen over in his fingers, click, click, and outside the viewport, the approaching station at Vethanu had become visible, a structure of light in the dark that grew incrementally with each minute. "That's accurate," he said, "for most of us. I know it's not universal, but close enough for policy." "Yes." He looked at her. The hazel eyes held that expression again, the fond one, the rueful one, the one that acknowledged something without quite naming it. "Thank you," he said, "for the conversation. Thank you for the mineral rations," she said, because it seemed important to name the small thing alongside the large one, and because she thought from everything she had learned that he would understand why. He did. He smiled, the real one, the small one that reached the eyes, and the transport slid into docking approach, and the bay lights went full amber, and the announcement came in 6 languages including, finally, the trade tongue. She disembarked first. She had documentation to file, reports to organize, a quorum session in 6 standard hours where she would stand before Prendau and 9 senior assessors and explain what she had found in the place where all the other catalogers had looked from a safe distance and found nothing but data. At the top of the boarding ramp she turned back. He was still in his seat, repacking his notebooks with the focused calm of someone about to begin a job he'd been thinking about for 4 days. He did not look up. She watched him for a moment, this ordinary, extraordinary creature with his comfortable silences and his 3 notebooks and his refusal to not notice when someone hadn't eaten, and she wrote in her notes, "Proximity error confirmed." Resolution. Proximity was the method, not the error. No corrections required. She walked down the ramp. She did not shake afterward, but it was close. The quorum session was 3 hours, which was short. She had prepared for 6. The data was that clear. Prendau asked only one question when she finished. He asked it in the precise, careful voice he used when something had disturbed the clean surface of his thinking. "You are saying we cannot defeat them without first being willing to become something they are not." "No," she said. "I am saying you cannot defeat them at all. That is the finding." She organized her notes. "What you can do is become capable of something more difficult than defeating them." "Which is?" She looked at him across the quorum table, at the 9 senior assessors in their cataloging gray, at the data screens full of 900 reports that had all agreed with each other and all failed to answer the question. "Understanding them," she said, "not as a tactical precursor, as an end in itself." She paused. "They'll know the difference. They always know the difference." There was a long silence. Then Assessor Prendau wrote something down, and the session continued, and she sat in her correct place at the correct distance from her colleagues and thought about a man reading 3 notebooks on a transit crossing, and how he had checked her mineral ratios without being asked, and what it meant to feel, against all cataloging discipline, that his presence in the universe was a thing she had a stake in. The fear had arrived before the loss, and then the loss had arrived, and then she had done what her briefing documents had never once prepared her to do. She had kept going. She had taken the attachment and the loss, and the thing that the attachment had taught her, and she had carried it into a quorum session and changed the record. That was, she understood now, precisely what they would have done. This was what she had learned, on a dare, sitting beside a human for the length of a crossing. She wrote it in the third notebook, the uncomfortable questions, the ones she didn't want to ask because the answers complicated everything, and she did not cross it out. She was, at last, learning to be dangerous.